People throw around the phrase that Rings of Power is anti-Tolkien, but I don't think that's what they mean. What they're really saying is they think it's bad and they don't like it. I actually believe that Rings of Power is anti-Tolkien, technically speaking, specifically through one of my favorite things about Tolkien's writing that I don't think gets enough attention: his mysteries. Tolkien gets a lot of praise for his beautifully constructed world building that contains a level of detail resembling actual history. Like, if you have a question about how something works in Middle-earth, chances are there is an answer. If not in the books, then in the appendices, and if not there, then in the Silmarillion, or in one of Tolkien's letters, or on a sheet of toilet paper he transcribed in Elvish in the 3rd grade. But to me, that detail is only half the reason his writing resonates so strongly. Because Tolkien didn't merely know how to write satisfying answers to questions, he also understood when to leave questions unanswered. When I was in college, I was among a long lineage of teenagers to write a lackluster essay about Shakespeare. The only thing worth mentioning is the idea that Shakespeare had a knack for writing characterizations that are both compelling and opaque. Instead of placing his eggs into the basket of plot-based mysteries that are answered by the end of a play, he invested in questions of character conception and motivation that keep the mystery alive long after you close the book. The fact we never truly know if Hamlet's ghost dad is real or a hallucination encourages multiple readings as the only way to answer questions the author doesn't answer himself. And one of my favorite things about Tolkien is his version of these infinite mysteries. For every answer in Middle-earth, there's a question that looms nearly as large. We know there are 5 wizards in Middle-earth, but know next to nothing about the 2 blue wizards. We know there are nameless things beneath Moria that are even older than Sauron, but don't know who or what they are. And one of the best examples of this idea is Tom Bombadil. There are countless theories about who exactly he is. Elrond, as a spry 3,000-year-old elf, said that Tom is the oldest living thing on Middle-earth. He says Bombadil was plowing pussy before Melkor even took his first shat upon Arda. The biggest compliment I can give Tolkien as a writer is that I was completely engrossed by Thomas Bombadil before I even knew he had a mysterious origin. And I think part of the reason these mysteries work so well is that more often than not, they're accompanied by characterizations that are compelling enough on their own right that the mystery component doesn't need to exist. But it does, and it keeps me coming back to reread the trilogy nearly once a year. Now, a fun comparison is the difference between Tom Bombadil and Halbrand. Both of them have mysterious origins, but in my opinion, where Tolkien emphasizes Tom's characterization and de-emphasizes his mystery, Rings of Power inverts that recipe. Speaking for myself, the show fixated so hard on the question of who Halbrand is in terms of whether or not he's Uncle Drewing Middle-earth that they lost sight of what actually makes Halbrand unique from a character standpoint, which is ironic because the only reason Sauron has name cachet is because Tolkien made his characterization interesting. To borrow a term from Dan Harmon, watching Rings of Power felt like eating a packet of ketchup. The questions of Halbrand's identity, the Morgul blade, who are the cultists, what is that fucking star map about? All of these mysteries can be fun as condiments, but they aren't meals by themselves, and Tolkien understood that. And it's worth mentioning my criticism isn't just that Rings of Power invests in plot-based mystery, it's that it invests in bad plot-based mystery. Most people saw the turns coming long before they happened, and when they did, there weren't many other vines to reach out to as a viewer. And so my point isn't to demean plot intrigue. Like, if you want to see an example of good plot-based mystery, might I suggest reading a book called The Lord of the Rings? And so while I think that balance between answered and unanswered questions helps explain why Tolkien is such a great writer, I think it alone undersells his talent with a different kind of mystery. As a kid, I remember being gripped by plot questions of what will happen next, what will Frodo do when he finally reaches Mount Doom? doom. And I think this category boils down to what will happen when well-seeded plot element A encounters well-seeded plot element B. And in the instances where Tolkien engaged in this, he was a master at it. But I think something that speaks to his philosophy to de-emphasize mysteries is how often he undercuts them. In the foreword to The Fellowship of the Ring, he notoriously spoils important character outcomes for Sam and Pippin and Saruman. He mentions how much he prefers writing history over allegory, and I think it's fair to say, mystery. And so just as that binary undersells Tolkien's ability, I think it also loses sight of another way that Rings of Power inverts Tolkien. Speaking personally, in the instances where Amazon didn't telegraph their plot twists, they left me completely unable to predict where the show was going next, which almost sounds like a compliment, but I promise I don't mean it that way. From the earliest pages of Tolkien, I always knew the chess pieces on the board and was on the edge of my seat wondering where they would move, whereas with Rings of Power, around episode 2, it felt like we stopped playing chess and moved to bingo. And then Connect 4, and then waterboarding. Like, I got motion sickness from the frequency with which the show would stretch out things I expected to be quick, truncate things I expected to make a meal of, and, worst of both worlds, invent and then immediately resolve conflicts. Like, I think Elendil's arc took place in the unseen world because it was completely invisible to me. And like, the idea of tearing apart Amazon's Middle-earth feels so overplayed by now that I'm much more interested in a celebration of Tolkien than a shat upon Rings of Power. But the trouble I ran into is that complimenting Tolkien more often than not requires me to insult Rings of Power, which bugs me because there's a portion of every fan base that's irrationally mad at adaptations because they're different than the source material they love. Like, I love Peter Jackson's trilogy, but by that standard, it would be a failure, along with every other adaptation out there. And so what's significant to me about Rings of Power is that it isn't just different bad, it's opposite bad. Like, I don't expect my new stepmom to cut the corners off my PB&J like my real mom would, but I do still expect to receive a sandwich. And Rings of Power didn't just give me crusted PB&J, it gave me just like a bag of ferrets, or whatever the platonic opposite of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is. But that's fine. I'm much more interested in praising Tolkien than ripping Amazon because I'm confident that in 20 years I'm still going to love the books. The same way that after 400 years, Shakespeare is still being analyzed by hungover teenagers. Whereas with Rings of Power, I don't think I'm gonna feel anything. The same way that in 2049, I won't be thinking about the red light I got today driving to the dentist. Like, I'm gonna be too busy slurping slippery street food with Harrison Ford.
Only poster collection. Wow.
Cool.
Thank you.